Hi, welcome to this fourth part in Patents for Entrepreneurs. Today we're talking about patent budgeting. My name is Ola Wassvik. I'm the CCO and co-founder of Lightbringer. About 20 years of experience as a deep tech founder and over 300 patents during that time. Also an author on the side with a book about deep tech coming out very soon, so keep an eye out for that one as well. This is not legal counsel, this is business advice. And as always with patents, you need to have legal advice as well. So you should have both sides, the business advice that I give you and the legal advice from an attorney to make sure that nothing goes wrong. Very important. But let's jump into it. So the problem for most companies that go into patenting is that they don't realize how much patents actually cost and how much they should be spending and where they should be spending it. The first thing you must understand is that patents are very expensive. And this is why this might be the most boring and important webinar you can attend, because it will cost money, significant amount of money. And if you're a founder and you've completely underestimated the amount of money you need to spend on patents, your board will be very unhappy and your investors will be very unhappy. So you should have all the information beforehand so you can make the right decisions and stand comfortable in front of the board presenting your patent strategy. Finance must be a part of this equation. So if you don't have a CFO yet, likely the CEO needs to be involved or whomever is responsible for the budgeting at your company. Of course, if you're the CEO and you do all the budgeting, then this rests solely on your shoulders. I will reiterate again, patents are expensive, but so is insurance for anyone who's tried to buy it. And patents are business insurance for tech companies. You're developing something new, and the only way that you can keep it for yourself so that no one else comes and steal what you built are patents. It's the only legal discourse you have. There is no copyright in hardware. Unless you have patents, people are allowed to copy you. And just as insurance, patents are expensive before you need it. But it's way worse if you don't have insurance and your house starts burning. That's essentially what can happen to your company if you've decided to completely forgo patents and someone comes and copies you. Or if you've launched a product and you realize someone else actually has the patent for that. That's when it becomes really expensive. That's when it becomes company killing expensive. But patents, like insurance, is expensive before you actually need it. So where does the money actually go? And this is a question that I've gotten so many times, I thought it better just to say it straight here. I've lived through this process many times, so I know where the cost goes. What you need to understand is that it takes on average over 4 years to get a patent granted. And that's if you go through the PCT phase. There are ways of getting patents granted faster, but what you typically do then is you just compress the costs into a shorter time period and you get less directionality in the patent, less time to actually make it work. So this long time period from filing to grant is not necessarily a bad thing. It's normally a good thing because during that time, your business will develop and you will be able to watch where your competitors are going. But during this 4-year timeline, you have multiple office actions. And an office action is basically when the patent office in a certain region or country comes back complaining that your patent should never be granted. And just to set the stage here, I've only had a single patent ever that went out without an office action. The default is that you will be rejected the first time around. There are so many patents and so many technologies out there that it's extremely unlikely that you're doing something in a space where no one else has done it before. And there are fees at every step, both for the attorney that needs to handle the case for you, but also for the officials who are handling the case on their side. So you get official fees and you get attorney fees, and these last over the whole time that the patent is pending up until grant. And the only cost that matters, unless you have cash flow issues, but that's another problem, the only thing that matters is the amount of money it costs until grant. So from filing until grant. How much does it cost over those 4 years? Quite often we see that people come in with some kind of sweetheart deal. They got an early rebate, and then when the costs actually start coming in, if they add up the costs from start to finish, they are on average. The only way you will be able to get a significantly lower cost is either to have a very large volume or use an AI service. So if you don't spend money in the beginning, you will be spending it later. If you do a poor draft in the beginning, you will spend much more later when you're trying to get that through. Remember this, the only number that really matters is start to grant. And your patent attorney knows the average cost from start to grant, because that's basically the top line of their business. I know the start to grant cost for Lightbringer. Your patent attorney, if you're using someone else, knows the start to grant cost. They might claim that it's variable and things can happen, but they do know an average, and they do know a worst case, and they do know a best case. So ask them for the range. And you should always budget with average to worst case. If you keep budgeting for best case outcomes, you will be very unhappy. If they refuse to tell you how much it costs, it probably means that you're in for a bad ride. So make sure that you have transparency. Make sure that you understand the start to grant cost. And this includes all the fees, not just for your attorney, but for the official fees. If the attorney is using another counsel for another country, you need to know how much they are charging and if there are any additional costs for them handling the case. Start to grant is all that matters. Drafting the beginning of the patent is expensive for a reason. It's typically a large upfront cost. At Lightbringer, we try to spread it out, but it's still a large cost. And something that far too many inexperienced people when it comes to patents do is they try to do some kind of DIY process. You do it yourself. This can feel good in the beginning, but it will hit you in the back later, because the thing that happens, if there comes an unprofessional looking document that does not fit with all the regulations that are required to actually file a patent, it will automatically get rejected, and you anyway need to go to an attorney to try to get it through the process. And the worst thing that happens is that you might disclose information that you shouldn't be disclosing, and your patent might not actually be covering the things that it should, or the scope is so narrow, so it's easy for someone else to go in and do what you're doing with just minor adjustments. So the real cost is when you actually don't get the right protection, where you should have used an experienced attorney in your field. And a reminder, I've said this before, but I'm going to bring it up again. You are not protecting the technology. You protect your business. That means that if you have no business, you shouldn't have patent protection. Patent protection should scale with a business, and that might be revenue or investment, whatever your business is at the time. You need to scale it with the business. And that means that strategy needs to come before filing. So you need to know what you're doing before you actually start doing it. Then there's a big cost cliff. And this is something that shocks a lot of people. You thought that drafting the patent and getting it filed was expensive. Wait until you hit the PCT and national stages. That's when the fun starts. So the first cost that hits is the PCT stage. That's a patent cooperation treaty. It's basically your ticket into the world. It gives you the ability to go into any country you want that is within the patent cooperation treaty, which is almost everyone, except for one important one, Taiwan. You need to handle that separately, especially if you're a semiconductor company. So at the PCT stage, first you have to pay a $3,500 official fee. And on top of that, you likely did adjustment during the first year, so you need to also pay for attorney hours when it comes to fixing the stuff that should go into the patent. So just because you file a patent doesn't mean the costs stop. They actually grow over time. And then it gets even worse at the national stage. That hits, if you go the PCT route, which I recommend that you do, after 30 months. That's when you decide which countries you go into. And this is typically where budgets start breaking, because now you don't only have to interact with the first patent office and the World Intellectual Patent Office, you need to start interacting with multiple patent offices in parallel, because Japan doesn't care very much about what's happening in the US and vice versa. So you need to handle them in parallel. This is how $30,000 in official fees for a single patent can happen. And this is on top of all the attorney fees and possible translation fees, etc. So just for Europe and US, you're in the range of $5,000 to $7,000, depending on your company size and exactly what the patent is. And every other country that you need to go into is typically in the range of $1,000 to $3,000, again, just in official fees. And then if you have a lengthy patent application that needs to be translated, and unfortunately, AI translation is not quite there yet, you still need human oversight there. So you might pay $3,000 to $5,000 just for translation into Japanese or Korean or Chinese or wherever you need to go. So on top of this comes the attorney fees, which most of the time are even higher than these costs. So if you go into 10 countries, which is not uncommon, then you can easily hit the 30K here. So what do you do to avoid this? Because one of the very big mistakes that I see a lot of inexperienced founders do and C-levels is that you think that one patent will be your entire protection. As I've talked about in the past, quality comes through quantity. You cannot guarantee that a single patent will cover your entire technology. It likely will not. You need multiple ones. Why would you then take your very first patent and bring it into 20 countries? And that's something that we're seeing a lot. People filing in Ecuador because they had a sliver of a market there. What you need to do, and you need to decide this up front, you need to understand where is your revenue. You should be covering your revenue, not putting a number of flags and hanging granted patents from random countries in your office. What I typically like to do is I use the 90 to 95% rule. You likely have 90 to 95% of your market in a limited number of countries. Very many Western countries are hitting the 90% mark just by including US and Europe. And if you add one or two more countries, you're up to the 95% mark. You might have a different business where you need other countries, but make sure that you cover the right countries. And as I'll talk about later, focus on the countries where you have the most revenue, where it's most important that you have coverage. Because fewer countries means you can have more patents in those fewer countries. Because you will have a patent budget, and that needs to be split out over everything you do. What I learned the hard way, and what I've then discovered that a lot of people had done before me, is something called portfolio tiering. So this is basically when you say, all my patents are not of equal value. Let that sink in. All your patents are not of equal value. And those of you with larger portfolios will know what I mean. You need to basically tier it into different tiers. These are the ones that I used, but you can make your own tiers based on how you like to do things. The first one we call the mission critical patents. So essentially, without these patents, we could not operate. If someone else had them, or if someone else would use them against us, there would be no way we would be able to operate, or no way they would be able to operate. And out of the 300 patents that I did, we had about 20 in this category. So less than 10% ended up in tier one. And tier one, we made sure to cover almost 98% of our market. Then we had tier two. They were the important ones, but they were somewhat limited in scope. And limited in scope meant that there was a risk that a competitor could design around them. If you're experienced in patents, you will know what I mean. You think that you were patenting something, and after going through the approval process and getting your patent granted, you actually didn't get the full coverage that you wanted. And you see this quite early on in the process. You can see it when you're going into the national stage. Then you can put them in a lower tier. We had about, I would say, 50% of our patents in this tier. They were valuable, but they had some kind of limitation. And we focused them to cover, in our case, 80 to 85% of our market. It was US plus Europe plus a few countries in Asia. Then we had the defensive baseline. This was basically all the others. They still had value and they were very annoying for competitors. These we decided to always do in the US. And why the US? Because it's so efficient to go after someone in the US. So these were in the US only. And we also tried to get them, if we could, in Europe. But we wouldn't fight until the bitter end in Europe, but we would always try to get them granted in the US. What's the advantage of actually doing this upfront? It creates predictable spend. Because if you, every time you have a patent, say, okay, let's decide what countries these patents should go into, you are always in the sunk cost fallacy mode. You basically say, I've spent so much money on this patent already, so let's just spend some more. If you decide beforehand what should be happening, you don't have to go into these trade-offs where, oh no, we spent all the money on this patent, we realize it's not so valuable, and now I can't spend money on this more important patent. So this creates stronger coverage where it actually matters. And the important thing here is that you do this upfront and you put them in the correct tier as soon as you can. This is not a legal exercise. This is a management exercise. And building these tiers, knowing exactly what should be in each tier, is something your management team should be involved. Everyone on the C-level, everyone who has a stake should set up this tiering system and basically be part of some kind of IP board when it happens to make sure that, yes, this patent goes into this tier. And typically the CTO is the one driving this, and they will have to come with a proposal and say, I think that these should be go into this tier. So it's still typically the CTO's responsibility, but it's very important that sales is in the process here because they know which ones are more important for the market you're going for. This is not something that you should update often. You should, at a maximum, revisit this once per year. Because if you do it too often, you again go into this process where you on the fly decide that you suddenly need to go into India with a patent without having decided it beforehand. And that's how you get escalating costs when you shouldn't have them. Not all countries are equal either. So there are what I would like to call difficult geographies. The patent system is a global patent system, but enforcement varies dramatically, and Western rules don't apply everywhere. And this is very important for you to understand. Most of you listening to this are likely Western companies. What and how things work in the West doesn't work like that in other parts of the world. So your strategy must adapt, and you must be aware that these things happen. So the three cases that I very often come up on and which I will cover here are China, India, and Brazil. These are massive markets, and a lot of them may have a large part of your revenue. So you need to be aware of what happens in these places. So China, as a concrete example, heavily favors domestic players. Unless you somehow have a domestic presence in China or have a partnership with a Chinese company, it's very unlikely that you will get a favorable ruling in China. But inside of China, the patent system works very well. So if you manage to get some kind of domestic presence, or better yet, some kind of joint venture with a Chinese company, you can have very high value of patents inside China. India and Brazil can be very slow and very uncertain. Anyone who's done business with any of these countries know what I'm talking about. It just doesn't work the way that it works in the West. Still, you might have value. For example, if you are in life sciences, India might be a very important place for you. If you are in forestry, Brazil might be a very important country for you. But just be aware that they are different and make sure that you don't assume the same things about patents in these difficult geographies as you do in other places. So finally, Predictability beats optimism. You will never be as unhappy as when you've spent all your patent budget and you come up with an amazing invention that you need to patent and you can't afford it because you spent all of that money protecting a not very important invention in Brazil. And the total cost is all that matters. You need to understand the total cost cycle. And that's exactly why we made the predictable cost payment model for Lightbringer, because I realized that this is what's important for tech companies. It's to know exactly how much it costs and when I need to spend that money. Markets decide the geography. You shouldn't patent in a country because one of your engineers wants to have a patent in Japan unless you have a major business in Japan or expecting to have a major business in Japan. You're not collecting flags, you're covering your market because patents protect the business, not the technology. And finally, make a tiering system. I'd be happy to help you out to set something up if you are unsure about how to start. If you do this tiering, it will avoid rash decisions and panic when the patent budget runs out because you paid too much too early. What this means in practice, you should always demand cost transparency from your attorneys. They will know the average cost. They will know the average amount of office actions, even though it varies per case. The important thing for you is the average and the worst case. So you can basically put your budget somewhere between the average and the worst case so you don't end up in a bad situation. And make your budget based on your business, on the milestones you have, so that you can clearly cover all the things you need. And make fewer but better geographic bets. Make sure that you understand where your market is. Make sure that you have coverage in Germany if Germany is your most important market. And the same thing with the US. This way, you will hopefully have a nicer time explaining to the board where you spent all that expensive business insurance for your tech. Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you next time. And feel free to reach out to me directly if you had any questions you don't feel comfortable with asking right.